Rockefeller Foundation, Portucus, and ICS. And to open our discussion, our conversation here, I would like to call, Emin Hamel, Associated Vice President from IISD.
Thanks very much. Right, well, I'm kind of analog, so sorry, I'm going to be reading off of paper. So good afternoon and welcome, everyone, to the side event on redirecting subsidies and public investments to enable regenerative and inclusive food systems. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to thank our co-organizers from Rockefeller, Portucus, ICS, and our pavilion hosts, FAO and CGIAR. Your support and contributions to both this event and more broadly are invaluable in both creating spaces for meaningful dialogue and in translating this dialogue into action. Now, when we talk about transforming our economies, we often overlook one of the most powerful policy levers at our disposal, public spending. Each year, governments spend trillions of dollars supporting various sectors of their economies, from agriculture and fisheries to fossil fuels. At present, well over $2 trillion of these subsidies are linked to environmental harm. These environmentally harmful subsidies lock us into unsustainable practices. They incentivize the overuse of chemical inputs into our agri-food systems, keep us tied to the use of fossil fuels, and drive both deforestation and biodiversity loss. And these are not abstract issues. They are issues which have real-world consequences for people, for nature, and our planet. At IISD, we recognize the transformative power of subsidy reform, and for more than 20 years, we've been at the forefront of global efforts to identify and reform harmful subsidies across a range of sectors. More recently, our work on food and agriculture has focused on the reform of environmentally harmful subsidies, specifically on identifying concrete reform opportunities. Importantly, this is not just about removing harmful subsidies, but about shifting them towards practices that actively support and incentivize practices that advance climate and environmental objectives. When designed well, subsidies can be an effective policy lever for driving and accelerating a just transition to sustainable food systems. They can reduce poverty and inequality, improve climate and nature outcomes, stimulate innovation and economic development, and improve public health outcomes. For example, introducing a payment for ecosystem services approach supported both forest conservation and restoration in Costa Rica. Through this work, we've seen that reform is possible, but it requires robust data and evidence, scalable policy solutions, strategies, and political will. Reform efforts to date have been slowed by vested political interests, economic dependencies, and sectoral lobbies resistant to change. And this brings me to the role of philanthropy in accelerating reform efforts. Philanthropic organizations have a vital role to play in helping to bridge some of the divides which have so far hindered reform efforts. They are well placed to fund independent research that improves transparency and awareness around what governments are subsidizing and builds the evidence case for reforms. They are also uniquely able to build cross-sectoral alliances and develop clear, actionable messages that resonate across political lines. So in this event, we're going to hear from a range of speakers, including from philanthropy, who will shine a light on how Brazil is reforming the way it supports agriculture to better align with climate and nature goals. We'll then hear short reflections from two of this year's COP30 special envoys, who will situate the issue of subsidy reform within this year's action agenda. All that remains now is for me to thank you all once again for joining us this afternoon and for being a part of the collective effort to ensure every dollar of public support contributes to food systems which nourish both people and the planet and which leave no one behind. And with that, it's my great pleasure to have a hand over to our first speaker, who's going to kick us off by diving a little bit deeper into what subsidy reform means for the food and agriculture sector. Thank you. Thanks, Anne. Can everybody hear me okay? Super. I'm just going to perch up here where I can hopefully also see my slides. Super. So as Anne mentioned, we're just going to dive a little bit more into detail of what this looks like in the agriculture sector, but keeping at that global level. So first slide, please, Anne. There we go. Super. So governments invest in their food and ag sector predominantly to help them achieve certain policy goals. And the type of goal is going to look very different depending on the geography, depending on the context, but can focus on food nutrition security, on reducing poverty, securing livelihoods, and increasingly now also climate and biodiversity goals. And one way that they do this, one of the most important ways, the most significant ways that they do this is through subsidies and incentives. And again, similarly, the types of subsidies and support will vary depending on the context, but will include support for certain inputs, support for outputs. This could be support for extension services, disaster relief, depending on the context. But ultimately, even though there's not necessarily a single definition of what we mean when we talk about subsidies, what we're getting at ultimately is how public money is being spent, how that's being used to achieve certain domestic policy goals. And I think it's worth just having a little look at the scale of that support at the moment. So if we look at the OECD figure at the moment, globally, we're looking at around $508 billion per year being spent on agricultural subsidies. So that is not an insignificant amount of money. And that is looking like it's going to grow significantly in the coming years. The FAO estimating that this is going to hit 1.8 trillion by 2030. Next slide, please, Anne. Oh. Super. Thank you. There we go. So what's the problem? You know, why are we here today talking about reforming some of these subsidies and how they're spent, where they're directed? And I think it's worth acknowledging, whilst they've been introduced to achieve certain policy goals, whether that's to improve food and nutrition security, to bolster rural livelihoods and incomes, what we're increasingly seeing is that there are a set of unintended but negative impacts from some of this support, some of these subsidies. And this has impact on our climate, our environment, but also on social development goals. And just to kind of unpack a little bit what that looks like, some of the subsidies that we see for agricultural inputs are incentivizing overuse of chemical inputs, particularly fertilizers, pesticides, and this is having a really negative impact on the quality of our soils. So we're seeing soil degradation, which is driving yield decline. It's lowering the nutritional quality of some of those food that are being produced. And there's also social impacts, negative social impacts to some of this support. So depending on the geography, benefits can disproportionately accrue to some of those larger farmers, and some of the smaller farmers or more marginalized groups are currently slipping through the net. So I think really what we're looking at the moment is a set of policies and subsidies that have been introduced to try and achieve a certain set of domestic policy goals that are actually undermining some of those goals in the long run in a very real and very tangible way. Next slide, please, Anne. Thank you. So briefly, just a very quick look at how we might approach redirecting some of these. Once we've identified where some of these negative impacts, these unintended negative impacts are occurring, where we might want to redirect some of that support, what some of those practices might look like. Done well, as we just heard from Anne, subsidies can help us reduce emissions. They can help us conserve biodiversity by redirecting some of that to support to practices like agroforestry, to cover cropping, that help reduce overuse of some of those chemical inputs that we just talked about on the previous slide. We can use these better to be strengthening livelihoods in the long term, rewarding sustainable production and not necessarily just higher yields and higher production. We can use these subsidies better to be reducing inequalities, looking at direct support, particularly to smallholders, to women farmers, to other marginalized groups. And I think also just with a sort of a nod to what some of the benefits are, we find ourselves at the moment in an age where governments are facing real squeezes on their budgets, and there's real pressure to cut budget, to use budget better. And I think this offers a real opportunity to help governments do that, to get more out of increasingly limited public funding. And they can use this to help deliver better on domestic and international climate and biodiversity goals. And really just in sum, ensure that the public money that is being spent is working much better for people, for our planet, for nature, that it's really supporting building economies. And that ultimately this is directed towards practices that build fairer, more resilient food systems that are better placed to withstand climate and market shocks. And next slide, please, Anne. So looking ahead, looking what we can concretely do, some steps to move towards reform. And this is something that we just heard from Anne, that IISD has been working on the reform of harmful subsidies for more than 20 years now. More recently, we've been doing a lot of work on the reform of environmentally harmful subsidies. So the reflections that I'm about to share now are for some recent research that we've done on environmentally harmful subsidy reform. And we've come up with 4 steps that we think, by and large, can guide reform efforts. Number 1, we need to really define the problem. Often there's a lack of data. We don't understand the scale and the scope of the problem, how much is being spent, where it's going, what some of those unintended negative impacts are, what they look like. And that's where processes like the national inventories of environmentally harmful subsidies that a lot of countries are currently doing under the CBD, under Target 18 on environmentally harmful subsidy reform, processes like this that can help build an understanding of where we're starting from, where do we need to move from. Secondly, starting to think about some of those policy solutions. What are the reform options? Once we understand the scale and the scope of the problem, what needs to be moved, where do we move it to? And starting to think, what does that look like? So that could be aligning your public spending with some of those national food systems transformation policy pathways that a lot of countries produced under the UNFSS process. We know a lot of countries are exploring developing national agroecology strategies, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa. There's, depending again on the geography, on the context, those policy solutions could look very different, but we need to have an idea of where we want this funding to be channeled to. And then thirdly, and I don't want to say most importantly, but I think this is often one of the big blockers, is really thinking about how we create political will for reform. And I think this is one of the most critical steps. It's also one of the hardest to control, to predict, but starting to think about where we can be building alliances, where those vested interests are that need to be shifted, what the sort of narratives are, who is maybe missing from the reform conversation that needs to be brought in. And again, at IISD, we're doing some work with the CBD Secretariat to really think about, in the context of environmentally harmful subsidy reform, who needs to be in those conversations? How do we build momentum ahead of the CBD COP17 next year? And then lastly, and very closely tied to that, I think, is just identifying and being ready for when policy windows open up. So making sure that you've defined your problem, you've got your solutions to hand, where you want your money to go, and you've built those alliances, you've built that political will. So when a policy window opens up, you're ready to move on it. So that could be, it could be anything really. It could be an election, it could be a budgetary crisis. Windows open up with sometimes little to no warning, and we need to be ready for those. And then last slide, please. Thanks, Anne. So just to conclude very, very briefly, I think we need to be clear. The narrative in the agriculture and the ag and food sector is a little bit different when we're talking about subsidy reform than it is perhaps in other sectors. When we talk about energy subsidy reform, we're not talking about cutting subsidies here. We're not talking about just removing subsidies. We're talking about looking at how subsidies are used, making sure that they're used better, more effectively, that they are delivering on a broad range of sustainable development goals, spending existing money better, basically, and recognizing what a powerful policy lever we've got in subsidy reform and how we can really harness this and use this, how this can help drive change and support a just transition to more resilient, more equitable food systems. That's it. Thank you. I'm going to hand back to Eduardo.
Well, thank you, Claire, for this brilliant introduction. To go ahead on our discussion, I would like to invite to the floor some organizations, but first, I would like to say that I'm honored to moderate this panel that we will start right now with such an exceptional group of speakers representing philanthropy, think tanks, grassroots organization, and financial sector. Over the next few minutes, we will explore how countries, and Brazil in particular, are rethinking agriculture subsidies, how to align public and private incentives with climate, biodiversity, and inclusion goals, and how cross-sector cooperation can unlock systemic transformation. Cassiane Lopes from Brazil Bank. And also, sorry, Gab Gomes from Propose. Well, thank you all again. And well, I would like to start with a question for Rodrigo Lima. Rodrigo, can you share the microphone with him? How are countries rethinking agriculture subsidies to align with climate and biodiversity targets? And where does Brazil stand in this discussion?
Thanks a lot for the question and for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you to discuss this topic that is really putting everyone to think and countries to design its best policies, thinking that subsidies should, at least theoretically, should be narrowed to public goods and most important practices on society and on agriculture in our case here. I think when it comes to biodiversity, it's even harder to discuss this. Climate it's kind of more tangible because we're talking about emissions and adaptation. Biodiversity, I think it's broader. But I think the challenge, at least from the perspective of Brazil, but for every country, but for Brazil, there are very, very tangible criteria that we must put on a equation of trying to define what is sustainable to have a public policy with subsidies to support. The first thing I would say for Brazil is deforestation, because no matter, we have legal deforestation in Brazil, but no matter if you have deforestation, you have carbon emissions, and policies should aim to get to zero, and subsidies should be directed to no deforestation agriculture. Then I would say that conservation and restoration of degraded land, because land with no soil fertility will suffer to produce on any agricultural system. And this is a very huge issue in Brazil, and I think the whole world. We will have Raiz launched next week here as a solution at the action agenda. So soil fertility and management and all the practices and so on. Then I would bring integration of agriculture, livestock, and sometimes, if possible, forest and agroforestry systems, which especially for smallholders are a very good opportunity to diversify and to enhance productivity and enhance the outputs from the same area, small areas. And then I would say that we need to have, there's potential other topics, but those land use, no deforestation, managing land and recovering degraded land and integration of systems, I would bring together with all of these technical assistance, because this is a huge obstacle for especially small farmers to adopt technologies, to adopt good practices, and to thrive based on improvements that they will adopt. So subsidies should narrow such goals like this I am bringing, because otherwise subsidies will simply, and in Brazil, subsidies on agriculture basically are used to reduce the interest rate paid by the producers to contract the credit. And we developed some analysis on agroecology, trying to map all the different practices that are supported by the government at the biggest Plano Safra, the Safra plan, and the PRONAF, that is the policy dedicated to small farmers. And there are several good things taking place, but there's a lot of improvement, room for improvement to go even further.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Federico. Thank you, Rodrigo. Please. Please, Federico, feel free to
Yes.
share your perspective.
Happy to. And I also want to give a round of applause to Eduardo, who just found out he had to be MC. We're very much in the COP Mutirão spirit. And unfortunately, João from Connexus could not come. So on very short notice, Eduardo took this job. Thank you very much. On very short notice, I am becoming João. And on very short notice, Gab is still Gab, but he's still Pronafão. And we're going to get to Cassiani in just a minute, who is Cassiani. But perhaps thank you also for setting the scene, Claire. I want to say one word about what philanthropy has to do against all those huge numbers, but then really get into an example from Brazil, where I think, to the point that Claire made, that it's about spending smarter and about looking for political opportunity. We thought that we would drill down on one example that is quite remarkable in this country right now, which is subsidized rural credit for family agriculture, otherwise called PRONAF, a national subsidized credit plan. But first of all, quickly, I would say, what does philanthropy have to do with all this? And this is really born in COP 28. It was a food COP, and there was a food systems declaration signed by 160 countries to make food systems sustainable. And there was a big call to action. More than 200 non-state actors signed on to this call to action, and then philanthropy. And we all know the number 650 billion, I think, is, I'm looking at the experts on agricultural subsidies, a huge number. And we said, what can philanthropy do? The first thing we did was very quick research, just some big numbers. And against those 650 billion in subsidies, we have about between 250 and 430 billion that are necessary to transition food systems to sustainability. And only about 44 billion today are being spent, so about a tenfold drop. And philanthropy, more or less, is 700 million per year on that. So you can see there's a 10x jump at each level. The obvious answer was that we have to work catalytically. And that's where this experiment that we're here to present today comes in, where a group of philanthropies, I represent one, but there are others. Portica is one of them. Pool money. This money goes to fund an organization that is part of this consortium that I am now representing. I'm now becoming João, and it's called Connexus. Connexus is a social enterprise that has developed a methodology to train rural credit agents to access this subsidized credit program in Brazil called PRONAF. We're going to hear from Banco do Brasil, who's one of the operators, in just a minute. These are, like I said, $12 billion a year that are lent out at between 0.5 and 6%. The benchmark in Brazil is 15%, so a heavily subsidized credit line. That's money that the Brazilian government could be earning more from by just operating in capital markets, and it's choosing not to. But nevertheless, this program has its challenges, and I think some of them were in the presentation that Clara gave. First of all, it's difficult to access. It's not always suited to the farmers that need it most. And that's where this PRONAF consortium comes in to pool our resources and understand, with the research of agroecony, with the methodology developed by Connexus, and with a partnership of banks like Banco do Brasil, how to improve the access to this program, but then also how to redirect it, which I think gets to the heart of the issue here. A lot of this, the money from this program, does not really go to something you might call agroecological, regenerative, or just good. Most loan officers loan to very conventional things that often make the problem worse. So there's another prong of the work, which goes towards working with financial institutions to really incentivize them to make these loans, again, with this credit that is subsidized. I'm going to pass it on to Gab, who's actually looks at the communication front and political opportunities that you're speaking, and seeing how we can gain support for this, and then we can pass on to Cassiani.
Thank you very much. So good to be here. It's an honor. My name is Gabriel Gomez. I'm the director of Purpose Campaigns. We are a global organization focused on communicating, engaging, and mobilizing people for causes that matter. Climate is one of our main issue areas. And in Brazil, we are deeply committed to working on the food systems and land use challenge, which is the biggest one when it comes to emissions, right? So as Federico was saying, PRONAF is, we are calling this project PRONAFão. PRONAFão is like the big PRONAF. It's a collective effort from agroecony, Connexus, Purpose, and MPA, which is the small farmers movement. And this is a collective effort because we know that we cannot increase the access of this credit with only one stream of line and one work stream. So we are working in a system to actually understand what are the levers that can increase the access from family farmers to this credit. So agroecony doing the research, Connexus, as Federico said, training this credit activators, the people that goes to the properties and create the credit project, so the person can actually go to the bank and get the loan. MPA doing the unities of demonstration, showing how to use the credit and creating examples that inspire other farmers to actually use the credit for good. And Purpose doing the communication strategy, because we know that we have three types of challenges when talking to family farmers about that. The first challenge is that not everyone knows what PRONAF is, how to get it, and what are their rights when they get it. So we need to focus on a very basic type of communication to make, not necessarily to increase the amount of money, but so just they can just take what they already what already exists. So information, the basic information, and Purpose truly believes that we need to focus on fighting mis and disinformation also, because there are a lot of misinformation around this this issue that we need to fight. So this is the first challenge, just informing. The second challenge on communicating is actually talking about the step by step. What do you need to do to get this credit, right? What are the first action you need to take in your property, in your community, with your family, with your partners, so you can actually access that. And the third challenge is to encourage and incentivize the use of this credit for sustainable practices. And we are focused on that on the third layer of communication, because in Brazil, 77% of the rural properties are from family farmers, if I'm not wrong. Even knowing that they only have 23% of the productive land, they are responsible for most of the food that the Brazilians have, but family farmers only take 20%. Only 20% of family farmers actually access Pronaf. So there is a huge gap. And as Federico was saying, when they access, not always they are using for sustainable practices or low carbon emission practices. And there are a list of practices that they could learn how to do it and actually implement, so we could decrease the emissions through these practices. So we know that this is not an easy challenge. It's not something that in 1 year we will communicate and inform everyone. We need to continue. But I'm so glad to know that Purpose, as a communication agency focused on mobilizing and engaging people, are in this group, because sometimes communication is just something that we forgot and we forget, and we need to include that as part of the process of changing perception, changing behavior, and most importantly, changing public policies and infrastructure to move better practices in Brazil. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Gab, for this to share your perspective on this project. So right now, I would like to invite Cassiane Lopes to share her perspective, the perspective of Banco do Brasil, about the subject that we are talking here. So please, Cassie, feel free to share your perspective.
So hello, thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor for me to stay here with you. So how can Federico and Gab say it? Our communities has many challenges to access credit. And it's a basic challenge, like don't have internet, missing documents, missing a specific document to access rural credit from Safra Plan, that it's a specific government program to put money more cheaper to improve familiar agro-system. So at Banco do Brasil, our goal is support the social bioeconomy from end to end. And we learned that when philanthropies stay present in our program and reduce the risk, the credit, the bank can enter with the credit, because philanthropy support the risk that the bank don't know. So support the earliest stage. And together, Banco do Brasil, Conexo, Zix, we made experience, we call it activation forums, and we help the communities to get and to get these documents and support these challenges. And for us, it's so clear that how can I say this? I'm sorry. Many familiars, farmers has great production, but missing technical assistance. So in our program, in our partnership, the philanthropy pays this technical assistance. So we have a good produce, and this produce is enough to pay the loan and improve more the production in the territories. One example of this is our results. When the bank started our bioeconomy programs, we have almost 1 billion reais in Amazon region, with the partnership with the philanthropy, with a different program of Conexus. We double our portfolio. Today, the bank has 2 billion reais in Amazon. So for us, was possible because we work together. the bank don't support some risks that philanthropy can help. So we really agree that when we work together in an ecosystem, we can do the difference in the territory. We can make the transformation with small farmers.
Okay, well, right now, I think I will hand over to Gab.
Yes, we were just commenting, and I'm sorry. Paulo Peterson hasn't arrived, right? Right. So in our program, we had Paulo Peterson was a special envoy for family agriculture under the COP30 presidency, and he was going to give us some closing remark. We've been tracking him. I think sometimes it happens here in COP. I think we're not going to be able to count on Paulo Peterson clearly. So that's what it is.
Well, okay, thank you, Federico. So, well, let's close our session here with closing remarks from Federico and our colleague from IISD. Please, Claire, come to the floor to share some closing remarks. What do you think? Okay.
Thanks, Eduardo. I think I can keep this very brief. I think one of the things that has struck me listening to the conversation between our fantastic panelists this afternoon is just the power that we have just by working together. I think far too often we're aware that we're working in silos, and yet we continue to still work in silos. And I think what we've been hearing today from our panelists just shows what we can achieve if we come together, the research community, think tanks, policy, communications, the banking sector, philanthropy, just how much we can actually achieve on those 4 steps towards reform that we outlined at the start. You know, building that baseline, building an awareness of what needs to change, reaching out to particularly farmers about where that money needs to go in order to help them, but also to further some of the sustainable development goals that we want to help governments be achieving. And thinking about the sort of narratives that we need to help bring people on board with those reform efforts, and trying to identify where those opportunities are. So I think that's probably my main takeaway, is just that this collaboration can be very, very transformative. And I think this is something that we need to try and replicate in other geographies. This is a great example that we can really learn from.
Thank you, Claire. And we'll pass the mic for a closing reflection.
Sorry, this is the spirit of Mutirão from COP.
Thank you, exactly. And I was just about to say, it's the spirit of this example that we gave you, where some organizations come together to really leverage our impact. I wanted to say one more thing also about integrating policies. One thing that was not mentioned here is that, yes, you have a rural credit program like PRONAF. There's another policy in Brazil, which is called PENAE, which is about school feeding. And that's also subsidized. That allows for, it mandates 30% of family agriculture food in school meals, and allows to pay for 30% more for those school meals. And when those two work together, we're finding that oftentimes school meals is the entry point for farmers to PRONAF. So again, the efficiencies of collaboration and Mutirão.
So thank you. What can I say in the final messages? For us, our success is that we work together, and the transformation happens in the ground. So when we saw how can the money could transform it, the reality of some family, we really believe that we invite more and more partners to be different. How say Claire in the beginning of the panel, it's not about cut subsidies, but spend smarter. And I think that this is a great way to do the things.
I think I want to build on what you just said, but also on what Claire said about political will. We have every year the revision of the Safra plan, which is this big plan that invests money in agriculture. And next year, we will have the opportunity to show the results of this collective effort. And of course, not only next year, but the year after that, and until 2030, and until 2045, and until 2050, until it actually changes the way that the government spends the money to produce food and to develop the economy. And I believe that this type of collective effort and mutirão brings us data and results that we can use to prove that it's possible to produce food, to feed people, and to actually fight climate change in the same effort, right? So.
Yeah, just one final remark. Those policies, I think everywhere, are created decades ago. And it's not easy to change policies that are there for several years, and there's a lot of interest and so on. But if we take the example of Pará state, for example, I said that restoring degraded land is critical to enhancing producers' ability to thrive and to change sustainable practices and so on. And Pará state has 6.6 million hectares of degraded land suitable for recovery to agriculture, to pasture, to agroforestry systems. But from these 6.6, 2.7 million hectares are small farms. 200,000, almost 203,000 small rural farms, and only 30,000 access credit from PRONAF. So come on, we need to change the mentality that taking the lowest interest rate credit, it's to buy to use the traditional practices and to buy cattle and make profit with cattle. No, you can buy cattle, but you need to at least keep your pasture, and you need to restore your pasture. And depending on the case, you need to switch production, but switch for what? I don't know, to do anything else. So there's extension and support. Otherwise, we will perpetuate a system that will support small farmers, but not the most that needs to thrive and to really bring those benefits as was presented at the beginning. Thank you.
And I think that wraps it up. Yeah, that's a wrap. Thank you very much for coming. Could we get a family picture, family photo?